We are talking here about scaling, because when we talk about how big can it get, a company, a sector, as we know from Claire Johnson from the Up Group, there has to be a lot of things happening. It's not just consumers finding you, but it's also the people you hire. And then what we see a lot at NOAH, companies which have great potential, great management teams, there's one thing they often get wrong: how to sell. And we were looking for a long time to find a panelist who we can talk about scaling operations globally. And we found Alex. And I would like Alex to introduce himself, and then we ask you a few questions.
Sure, thanks, Marco. So I had the opportunity to grow internationally, and starting from Silicon Valley, actually, was a couple great companies like Salesforce.com and SuccessFactors, which last year got bought by a German company, SAP, for $3.4 billion. These are obviously B2B companies introducing a new product category oftentimes, or definitely a new delivery model. And so somewhat different stories than in the consumer world, but happy to share the learning experiences. One of the things that we've learned from the experience and why I set up Glocal is that even a lot of success stories have some setbacks along the way. And so I would love to help both the European companies and the Americans remove some of the obvious mistakes as they expand internationally.
Okay, let's talk about the mistakes, which is usually the stuff we should look at when we try to get things right. What are the most common mistakes you see when companies try to grow globally? I remember this business, Boo.com, which was an online fashion business. They were priding themselves of opening a lot of offices.
Right.
What are the most common mistakes you see?
Well, I mean, the example of Boo, which tells you how old we are, because I remember that as well. That was an example of a company that started expanding before it figured out its product market fit. And I think that is kind of a case of Miley Cyrus or Britney Spears, where you start your career too fast, too much glamour before you figure out who you are, who are your customers, and so you expand too fast. I think the other mistake, and that one is probably more common in Europe, is something I would call the 40-year-old virgins syndrome, where you wait too long. You want few more customers in Europe, in your core market, a little bit more revenue, so you miss the opportunity.
So that's
relative.
Too late.
That's too late, right? That's so like
too early, too late.
Too early, too late.
How do you know if it's right?
Well, that depends, obviously. That's the billion-dollar question. But certainly a lot of the timing components depend around your product, first of all. And are you a company that's bringing a brave new innovation into the world? A lot of Silicon Valley companies tend to do that. Or are you a company that's really innovating around the business model, and that business model requires that you scale and grow much faster because it's a winner-take-all market, and your product is actually not that complex. What's really complex about you is your ability to scale. So that's one big consideration around your time.
The product has to be ready.
Product has to be ready.
You should have had success at least in one market.
Ideally, you either, unless your name is somewhere, right? You gotta, and this is your core expertise of expanding internationally. You gotta figure out, your core market, and at least one other market. And then once you've got a couple markets going, and then you can start having a pattern recognition of ramping up the investment, and hopefully having great investors on board that will help you support in the process.
Okay, so we covered already a lot. We know a lot of companies fail because they go too early international. Some go too late. Some go even without having a product ready. So let's talk about, once you got the timing right, your product is working, how do you find the right people? Let's say you are successful in Germany, you want to go to the next large market in Europe. Let's say you're not going to the UK because the Americans are very strong here. You want to go to another big country, France. How do you find the right team in France? And let's say it's like a B2B, like an enterprise sales business. How do you find the right people?
Well, look, so first, I'll answer that. But first, is France the right market? I think that's a part that I often see, particularly in the B2B context, companies, make these decisions not in a data-driven way, because sometimes the data is hard to get, right? You don't necessarily have the database of detailed analysis of all the likely prospects for you across Europe. And so you just know some guy in France, and you go to that guy and you pursue it very opportunistically. I think the way that works for companies is when they actually have a strategy, right? They have a plan, and they have a commitment from the rest of the organization that you can execute on that plan. That makes it much easier to attract top talent into the organization and then make them successful, because that French general manager that you'll bring on, hopefully with help of Claire or somebody else or existing relationships that you have, is actually going to be in a position where he can grow the business much faster and have the support from the home team.
So you say before you go to a market, make your homework what the right market is. So are we talking about like a typical analytical work where you look at some KPIs of a country and then you benchmark it? What data you would look at typically?
Well, it really depends on your market. So for consumer markets, obviously what you're talking makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes B2B companies make the mistake of applying the consumer approach. If you're selling large products, you got to figure out where the companies are, was the largest potential to be your target customers, and that's actually turns out to be very different data. That stuff we at SuccessFactors, one of our biggest success stories is we crank out the data from Bloomberg, extract a very rich data set that allowed us to prioritize the customers on the metrics that really matter to our business, which is personnel spend. And that's not normally how, unfortunately, most businesses look at. They just look at number of employees or sales, and then go from there.
So you have your right country identified with the analysis. Alex, this consulting team has given you the country. Should you launch several markets at the same time, or should you first do one and then potentially multiply the efforts into 3, 4, 5, or even 10 countries?
Yeah, it really, again, depends to what kind of business you have. But if you're really an innovative business, once you figure out the strategy, kind of the S part, then you got to, again, execute like a small guy. And you can't really execute like a small guy if you are spreading your efforts too thin, if you have no senior member from your founding team, from your home market, in the local market, really helping you get the credibility from the potential prospects, from the ecosystem. So listening to the customer in 1 or 2 markets that are representative of the ones that you will scale to later is really rolling up your sleeve and becoming an entrepreneurial organization again. So that would be my advice. And before you start scaling.
Not all markets are obviously created equal.
Obviously, this is probably another common mistake, back to the mistakes where people pursue things opportunistically. There's a lot of momentum from inbound marketing going on right now, a lot of excitement about that. But one of the big distractions that comes with that is, what looks like an attractive deal, but actually is going to take out more of your resources, more of organizational mindset, and add more complexity to a business without generating long-term revenue potential. And so I think one of the key things for building, especially across Europe, where you've got a lot of complexity, is really helping your sales team and your sales organization to focus on what are going to be the key accounts, what are going to be the key regions where you want to drill in and make them success, versus try to cover the whole Europe, or as Americans like to call it, EMEA region, which is quite silly.
So let's talk about the B2B side, which we're all excited about, because you can probably manipulate your success much better than on the consumer side, where the consumer side you just need reach. We work with a lot of companies who sell to big conglomerates or big global businesses in one country. And then you have a situation that the big customer says, hey, you should really grow into the other countries we are operating in. How can you piggyback from the success of that client relationship in one country to the other countries? Because I remember, like in the private sales industry, Vente Privée, they have a client Nike, and then they try to replicate the relationships across other countries. And it's very hard when they think you can automatically assume they will work with you. How can you grow your customer relationship, which is strong in one country, cross borders? What is your advice?
Well, again, it's a matter of focus, right? Ideally, you have 3 or 4 customers that will pull you internationally, and frankly, that is actually one of the best ways to grow. but you got to make sure that they're taking you into the regions that actually are the ones that are kind of going to be sustainable for you as a business. They're the ones that will not distract the product development efforts. They're the ones that are ideally using the distribution channels that you already are familiar with, be it Google in the consumer or even B2B context or LinkedIn. And so I think prioritizing, again, around which customers do you want to expand and in which markets is key. And sometimes it means saying no. Because you got to be ready and you got to make those customers successful. I mean, as the B2B context is that you've got to keep your customers successful for the long term, you're delivering a lot more of the product and the service as a SaaS provider, which is increasingly the mode of expanding internationally, then you have to take on that complexity. You can't just give it to some third-party reseller and distributor the way you used to and just dump it on them. You've got to pick the right regions that are going to be the future growth generators.
So let's talk US. I think we all know tons of companies who try to grow to the US market, spend a lot of money on advertising, usually been visible on caps or television even, and they didn't make it. Now, at our conference, we have 600 CEOs. Most of them, I assume, are not active yet in the US market. When can you make the big step to the US market? What kind of checklist you would recommend an entrepreneur to have? Or you say the US market is like every other European market from a European perspective?
Well, it is like any other international expansion, but I think one of the key things that I don't see enough entrepreneurs ask themselves, to paraphrase the American President Kennedy, is ask not what America can do for you, ask what you can do for America. Figure out where there is a gap in the American ecosystem, because it is a very competitive market. And so probably more competitive than what you're used to if you've been expanding just across Europe or you've been operating in your home market. And make sure what you're bringing there is going to be uniquely differentiated. And also, because it's competitive in terms of customers, in terms of hiring top talent, you've got to create the value proposition not just for the customers, but for also those people that you want to make you successful in America, right? I mean, what we talked about strategy, we talked about executing like you're a startup again. And the third part for me is it's about experience, right? How do you bring top tier experienced folks that will be able to bring in other great experienced folks and have them motivated working for you? And a hint, American entrepreneurial types are much more excited about equity than they're used to here in Europe. So that's another big differentiator of how you got to create a value proposition for people to want to work with you.
Can you name a few European examples who expanded in the US who did a great job?
I think in the B2B context, ClickTech is obviously one great company. On the more consumerized side, you've got players like Podio, Prezi kind of merges consumer and bizhumor sectors. So there's great example. Obviously in the consumer world, you've got the Spotifys of the world. So it is absolutely possible. But it is, if you think about Spotify, I mean, how long did we hear about the launch? I mean, this was
Daniel had to move to the US.
And you had to move. And this kind of, if you remember one thing from this talk, and this was after lunch, so let's mix things up. It's strategize like the big guys, execute like your startup again, and then get the experience both from your founding team, ideally, and also from top tier talent in the US. And by the way, that spells sex, as I can see it. So it is sexy.
And by the way, I think what I see that a lot of companies who hire local teams, they kind of hold on to them. They're always glorifying them. Oh, I have this great new country ahead. And then at some stage, when it doesn't work, they need to admit failure and send in some of the kind of original founding team in. I think Klarner, who launched in Germany, the CEO recently said that they worked with a German team, and at some stage they realized, it just doesn't work out. So they send in some people from Sweden, and they managed then to grow. So if you look about who you put into the operation of the new country, would you recommend a mix of people from your own business, from the home market, some people from the new side, or what is your thinking around?
I think you bring up a great point. So ideally, you want somebody very senior from your leadership team, co-founder, or somebody who does have the credibility within the company, because a lot of the challenges around international expansion are actually internal. You know, we underestimate how difficult it is to get the mandate, how difficult to get various functions within the organization to support the expansion. So somebody with a clout is key, but at the same time, if they're not going to have the local experience, the local network, they're likely to be set up for failure. So it's really a combination of the two. And by the way, there's a ton of logistical complexity if you haven't done this before, and most startups don't have the facility to handle that. So you can also rely on some third-party vendors to reduce that complexity, because otherwise you'll have your top talent focusing on the wrong things.
How do you monitor your success of expanding outside your home market?
Well, if you don't have a plan, you can't, right? And then it ends up being, well, did we hire the wrong people? Did we bring in the right people? And so you just end up wondering and firing them and restarting again.
And it's becoming very messy then.
And it's messy, and then what do you communicate to the prospects and the ecosystem partners like Google and Facebook in the market? You know, you can have orgasms only that many times, that you're faking, right? Before people realize that you're not a real player. So having a plan, obviously doing it in a lean way where you can follow up and adapt the plan is one of the ways in which you could start tracking the success. And I think that's why doing it on a slower basis in one country allows you to start having a pattern recognition of what it actually takes.
And I guess looking at the growth opportunity, how big can it get, growing internationally must be the most important management function after, or kind of thing to work on after the success in one country has been observed.
Well, I think that's true for some business models, right? But I would say that's not necessarily given for other business models. So, for us at SuccessFactors, when we were expanding, we had to look at product modules because we had these expensive salespeople in US and internationally that we had to make sure that they leverage the relationship that they built with heads of HR and CEOs across a broad suite of products that we'd have to sell. So sometimes it's deepening the product capability is still a priority, but obviously the world is getting much smaller, and in some markets, in particular like the enterprise software, when you look at the non-US or the non-US revenue of US headquartered public companies, we did some data crunching being an inner geek, it found that traditional enterprise software companies, 44% of the revenue is coming from outside the US market, whereas some markets like e-commerce, only 16%.
Google makes more money outside the US
than
inside the US.
Google, Microsoft, Oracle, but yet some markets are much less vulnerable to attack from the Americans.
Great. Well, Alex, thank you so much for these insights. If you guys want to go international, don't forget to ask Alex before.
And if you want to go international, come to this conference, come to all the great events that you're doing. Marco is the conduit for real international expansion. So hats off to you.
Thank you.